Good evening, and welcome to this week's episode of Wanderlust Wednesdays. We're mixing things up a little bit because I'm going to be speaking about four itineraries at the same time, through a focus on the city of Vienna, the capital of Austria, and we look at Vienna through the spectrum, if you will, through the prism of architecture in that city. And so we're mixing things up a little bit, and I will first present to you the itineraries that have a lot of time spent in Austria's capital, Vienna. So we start off with the romantic Danube. That is an itinerary that takes you from Regensburg in southern Germany and then to Passau and through the Wachau Valley. And you look at the left-hand side of your screen, you see that itinerary where you see the word Danube. That's where the Wachau Valley starts. And then Krems is sort of where it ends. That's the name in the middle of the screen. And then you see Vienna, and the cruise ends in Budapest. And James, you have, I think you have a little video of the romantic Danube that we should take a look at. And then I'll talk about the Danube Waltz next.
This beguiling 8-day itinerary showcases some of the Danube River's favorite cities, plus legendary landscapes along the way. Your journey begins with an overnight in Budapest, Hungary. Known as the Paris of the East, the impressive architecture and culture are sure to draw you in. Next up, Vienna, Austria's capital, and its fascinating cultural treasures, where you'll enjoy another overnight stay. Then it's on to Göttweig Abbey, a Viking exclusive, where monks work and worship just as they have for more than 900 years. You'll sail on to enchanting Passau, Germany, a quaint town that in ancient times was once a Roman colony. Your Viking journey concludes with an overnight in charming Regensburg, giving you plenty of time to explore the heart of its medieval city centre, a UNESCO World Heritage Site.
Okay, so that was the romantic Danube, and another itinerary that has Vienna at its heart is the Danube Waltz. This itinerary is on the right-hand side of your screen. It starts in Passau in southern Germany, right on the border with Austria, and then it largely follows the same course of the romantic Danube. The big difference between these two itineraries is really that in the romantic Danube, you have Regensburg, and that's a wonderful city. That's really one of my favorite cities in Germany. Whereas in the Danube Waltz, you have a somewhat stronger focus on Central Europe with Vienna, Bratislava, the capital of Slovakia, and then Budapest. And if I were you, I would really, over time, I would do both. But if you have to choose, then you have to consider one has Regensburg in it, the other has Bratislava. That is really the biggest difference. And James, I'm sure that we can show people a little video of the Danube Waltz as well.
Our Danube Waltz itinerary offers 8 days of enrichment amid the cultures of 3 European countries. Stroll the cobbled streets of Passau, Germany. Enjoy a call in Linz, Austria. Experience the true beauty of the region with scenic sailing on the Danube through the enchanting Wachau Valley. Then it's on to Krems with its still-working Göttweig Abbey. In Imperial Vienna, you'll be seduced by history and Baroque splendor. Tour Slovakia's capital of Bratislava and see its imposing castle. Before arriving in your final destination, magnificent Budapest.
Okay, and then there are two somewhat longer itineraries. The first one is the European Sojourn, and the second one is the Grand European Tour. And I'll start with the second one, the Grand European Tour. We're not going to show you the video of that one because the European Sojourn has a lot of the same content, but it is an odyssey. It takes you all the way from the North Sea, almost to the Black Sea, but it takes you clear across Europe from the Netherlands to Romania. And to get an idea of just the variety of countries and the variety of landscapes and cities that you see, have a quick look at this video.
This 23-day itinerary includes 8 remarkable countries. Begin your voyage in fascinating Amsterdam. Sail on to Kinderdijk and its network of windmills. In vibrant Cologne, visit Germany's largest cathedral, a UNESCO World Heritage Site. From Koblenz, you'll visit Marksburg Castle, perched high above the Rhine, while quaint Miltenberg features some of the oldest half-timbered houses in Germany. In Würzburg, tour the ornate Baroque bishop's residence. Bamberg is a picturesque medieval city perfect for strolling. Nuremberg offers panoramic views from the city walls, while Regensburg has buildings dating to Roman times. Passau is home to Europe's largest pipe organ in St. Stephen's Cathedral. And in Melk, you can explore the well-preserved 900-year-old Benedictine monastery. Vienna is rich in art and architecture. Budapest is stunning, especially the dramatic Fisherman's Bastion. Visit Belgrade and its famed Kalemegdan fortress. You'll cruise the Danube through the dramatic Iron Gate, while at Belogradchik you can explore its dramatic rock formations. Spend a day in Veliko Tarnovo, Bulgaria's former capital, before finishing your adventure with a visit to Bucharest, where you'll tour the city and enjoy an overnight stay.
Okay, so now you have an idea of the different itineraries that include Vienna. And before we really dive in, let's talk a little bit about the other building blocks that you would have to extend your journey with us on the river ship beyond the boundaries, if you will, of the itinerary. As an example, Budapest is a city where you could spend a week easily. And therefore, for all the itineraries that start or end in Budapest, we offer 2 extra nights. You can either do that, I would say, as a standard package where we offer you 2 hotel nights, the services of a Viking host that will help you make the most of your time, and daily breakfast. You can also have it be a little bit more guided. Obviously, that is a little bit more expensive, but it gives you the advantage of having someone with you where you go. You can do on the side of Amsterdam for the Grand Euro, spend 3 nights in Bruges and in Antwerp, and basically you stay in one city and then you travel to the other city, so you don't have to unpack more than once. That corner of Belgium, Flanders, of course, has an enormous amount of history. It has very charming cityscapes, and it has a lot of World War I history. That is actually quite interesting and very, very impressive. So again, you can do more than just cruise on the river. There are some really meaningful and really well put together extensions that you can book. And then the question often comes up, when do we go? You see some more extension packages, by the way. You can do Amsterdam, you can do The Hague in Amsterdam. Some of this is a little seasonal, and it's not a bad idea to ask your travel agent or ask someone in our call center to walk you through the various different options. I understand that sometimes the opportunities, I think choice is great. Quite often it helps to have someone that can help you navigate the choices that you have. And this is such a splendid photograph that you're going to be looking at in a minute. Here is a river ship through the Wachau Valley, and in the foreground is the small little community of Dürnstein. And you would think, oh, we have to go to this particular monastery because that must be absolutely unique in Austria. The fact of the matter is, these kind of communities, religious communities with churches, with a monastery, quite often with little towns around them, you find those all over Austria and all through the Wachau Valley. We visit the monastery of Göttwijk. We quite often still visit the Abbey of Melk. Vienna has churches in this same style. when it comes to that, Baroque architecture, and that's what you're looking at here, Baroque architecture has really left its mark on Austria and on Vienna. When is the best time to go? We offer cruises along the Danube throughout the year. So let me walk you through the various different advantages and possibly disadvantages. You travel early, and there's a chance that the weather is still a little nippy, but the crowds aren't going to be there. And mostly, I would say, a city like Vienna can really stomach a lot of visitors. You're never going to feel cramped. You really won't. But if you like it very quiet, and if you don't mind that it is maybe a little cooler than in summer, then I would say in April, late March, April, May, June is splendid. June tends to sometimes get a little rainy. In summer, August and September tend to be relatively warm and dry. June, you can still get a little bit of a sprinkle. And then as you move into fall, temperatures are still very, very pleasant in this part of the world. October tends to be a month where it can get a little cool. Of course, by October, the crowds have left everywhere, and that may be an advantage if you're so inclined that you would like to see, let's say, you would want to see a lot of museums, a lot of churches, cathedrals, but you hate waiting. I would go in October at that point. November, the end of November, is when all along the Danube cities have their Christmas markets, and that gives the entire experience a completely different flair, a completely different flavor, and that's not just the Christmas market. It's the entire atmosphere from the small towns that you go to the big cities. It's very, very special. From the food and drink that you have around that time of year, to the lights in the streets, to the markets themselves, it feels like it's a different kind of Europe. You could easily do a Danube waltz in summer and another Danube waltz during the time of the Christmas markets, and you'll have two completely different experiences. So that is about when to travel. There isn't really a bad time to travel along the Danube. In some cases, the weather will get a little cool, and that's when we actually just stop cruising. It can get to a point where it's just unpleasant, and that's when you will not find these cruises on the calendar anymore. So let's talk about Vienna and Vienna's architecture. And I have to forewarn you, we talk about architecture and the lay of the city together. And that means we will start with Vienna's ring road, because that usually is the first thing that you see when you enter Vienna. A coach will take you from the ship into the heart of the city, and you will end up on the ring road, and you will start to see these carriages. And in Vienna, you don't call these carriages, you call them fiakers. And this is a splendid way, of course, albeit a little slow, to explore Vienna and to explore the ring road. And the ring road was really constructed in the 19th century. So we will go back and forth a little bit in history, so bear with me. We're talking about the 19th century when you visit Vienna's ring road. And really, we're talking in Austria, this is a German word, the Gründerzeit. And the Gründerzeit was an era in the last third of the 19th century, where the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the German Empire really kind of more or less ruled Europe. Gründer is foundation, and these were the founding years of the German Empire. And the German Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire had really good relations with each other. And they kind of together went through an upswing, an economic upswing at that time, and a cultural upswing. And what is interesting is that there was a lot of money made in industries, in rapidly developing industries, in trade. There was peace. This is a part of Europe that has seen a lot of wars, and there was a time of relative peace that allowed for a great development. And interestingly, people were quite conservative in their tastes. And what you see here in the next slide, after the fiaker, and you can see it in the background a little bit. This is it. This is Vienna City Hall, and this is a neo-Gothic style. And this is quite typical for that era, that big buildings were built, opulent buildings, and when it came to the style, people would go back in history and build neo-Gothic, very, very popular, neo-Romanesque at times, neo-Baroque, all these styles that were adjustments and reinterpretations of traditional styles that you can find still all over Vienna. And we'll get to that in a moment. What's interesting about the City Hall is it was designed by someone who had grown up around Gothic architecture. His name was Friedrich Schmidt, and he later became Friedrich von Schmidt after he designed Vienna's City Hall. And if you in German-speaking countries, if you become from Friedrich Schmidt, you become Friedrich von Schmidt. That is like the equivalent of the Sir in the UK. So Sir Elton John and Sir Paul McCartney and Dame Judi Dench. And here we had Friedrich von Schmidt, who also became an honorary citizen of Vienna after designing the City Hall. And he had grown up, he was the son of a pastor. He had grown up working his way up the ranks in first as a craftsman, and then a draftsman, and then an architect around Gothic churches. He studied Vienna's Stephansdom, which is the great Gothic church in the middle of Vienna. He also spent a lot of time in Cologne working there in what is called the Dombauhütte. And Bauhütte is if you translate that, it's basically a workshop. All these cathedrals, all these medieval cathedrals, and most of them still have these, but through their building history, through their construction history, they would have a workshop that employed dozens of people for upkeep, for maintenance, for repairs. And today, those are actually, for a while they were gone. And then as people started to get more interested in the heritage of these phenomenal cathedrals, more and more they reopened these Bauhütten, these workshops, and they're very active now. And quite often when you visit these cathedrals, you will see where the Bauhütte is, and in rare cases we will even take you inside. In Cologne Cathedral, for instance, we have a very good relationship with the people from the Bauhütte, from the workshop, and we can take you behind the scenes. We're working on doing something like that in Vienna as well. We're not quite there yet. So that is neo-Gothic, what you're looking at, the City Hall of Vienna. And then in the next slide, that is more of a neoclassical style, and that is the Art Museum of Vienna. It's basically the Imperial Art Collection. And when you walk around Vienna, you look at a map, and Austria is a relatively small country. But Vienna, of course, at one point was the heart of an empire, of an enormous empire. Charles V, or Karl V, as the Austrians would have called him, he was the emperor over a kingdom where the sun didn't set, because Spain was part of his realm, and therefore the Spanish colonies in the New World, the Low Countries, Holland and Belgium, were part of his realm, as was Austria. And so interestingly, the Imperial Art Collection that is housed in this museum, for instance, has one of the best collections of Bruegels. He was one of the great Flemish primitives. And you would wonder, why would paintings that came from Belgium end up in Vienna? It was because Belgium at the time didn't exist. It was just part of what was often referred to as the Austrian Netherlands. And actually at the time, Belgium was part of Spain. But again, the emperor ruled over Spain as he did over Austria. And that explains why this is such a stellar art collection. There's another slide of the art museum, but we'll move on a little bit from here to talk about some other buildings that you will see. And this is also, these buildings are still all quite close to each other along the Ringstrasse, along the Ring Boulevard that circles the center of the city. The next image that you see, this is a magnificent lobby, or a stairwell, whatever you want to call it. And it is the stairwell of the Imperial Theater, if you will. It sits right across the street from City Hall. And it's in a somewhat different style. It's in a neoclassical style, or and it's a little bit of a mix between neoclassical and neo-Renaissance. It has this incredibly opulent lobby. And what's interesting, when you drive by there, on the facade of the building, and you will find this all over Vienna, there are two letters, K and K. And K stands for Königreich und Kaiserreich, because the Austrian emperor was for much of the 19th century and very early on in the 20th century still, the emperor of Austria was also the king of Hungary. And so K and K basically means emperor and king. And that's what you will find on the facade. It is still one of the best known theaters in Central Europe. And it's beautiful. What I find most fascinating about that building, honestly, is what's inside. Of course, is great. It's a beautiful theater. But when you're there, when the play is over, or when whatever performance it is over, you will see filing out the creme de la creme of Viennese society. And if there's one thing that Viennese society does well, is have celebrations. People are dressed to the T, where they can really mingle with people who have that same interest in the magnificent culture that Vienna still has. And it's really because it used to be this center of an empire, and it has kept so much of this art. The great and interesting part about Vienna is also that it's always had a lot of very traditional art, but also it has always had a little bit of an edge, and we'll get to that in a minute, because what you see on the next slide is the Belvedere Palace, and that was built for Prince Eugen von Savoyen, who was a relative of the Austrian Empire, and he deserved this palace because he did a lot of fighting he was a military leader, and he did a lot of fighting for the Austrian Empire. And when he had time, he would come back to Vienna and he would stay in this magnificent Baroque palace. And you can see that this is much smaller than the big palace that Vienna is known for, Schönbrunn, but it is at least as beautiful. It's very playful. It has these fountains. It has a very nice formal garden, and there are two buildings. The first one is the one that you see here. It's the Upper Belvedere, and then you may have seen this in a video. At one point in one of our videos, we have this beautiful view over Vienna, and the Upper Belvedere that you see here sits on a hill that overlooks the city. And if you go to the back of this building, you will have that spectacular view over the city and over the Unteres Belvedere, the lower Belvedere, and that's in the next slide. And this is now a two-part museum. And the lower Belvedere, and it's a building with a red roof, this is it. The lower Belvedere has a collection of Baroque art. The most interesting pieces there are some heads that were done by an artist called Franz Xaver Messerschmidt. And that's quite a mouthful, but you will recognize, if you go there, and you really should, if you go there, you will instantly recognize his work when I tell you what he did. He was a sculptor, and he studied facial expressions, the strangest facial expressions. He would study expressions of someone that was just about to sneeze, someone that was that had a toothache, someone, actually, it gets a little grisly, but someone that was about to be hung. And he would intently study facial expressions and then create these sculptures. And so they're still really interesting studies of the human face, if you will. They've never been replicated or duplicated, and they're so weird in such an interesting way that they're almost timeless. You would think that this could be some avant-garde artist that came up with this 2 years ago. They're still even a little shocking. So those are the treasures in the lower Belvedere. And then I'll talk about the upper Belvedere, because that is also a museum, and that has a great selection of, it's a cross-section of Austrian art, primarily though of the 19th and 20th century. And probably the most famous piece there is Gustav Klimt's Kiss. Gustav Klimt is quite well known today because he worked so much with gold, and it was such a he had such an impact at the time. But there's been somewhat of a Klimt revival for the last 20 years or so. He is ubiquitous. You see him everywhere. You can buy fridge magnets with the Kiss. It's just a worldwide, very, very famous painting these days. And it's hard to imagine what a shock it was when he worked at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century. He was one of the founding members of a group that introduced the secession in Vienna. And we'll get to that later. But can we move to the slide that shows the Kiss? Very famous painting. You'll recognize it instantly. There you go. So that is just one of many great highlights of the collection in the Belvedere. That is a cross-section of really the best art that Vienna has to offer, or that Austria has to offer for that matter. And then we'll take you back to the Baroque era, or we stay in the Baroque era when it comes to the architecture. So where the Belvedere is a somewhat smaller, somewhat more intimate palace, right in the middle, right in the heart of Vienna, a little bit outside of Vienna, is Schönbrunn. And Schönbrunn was really where the Austrian Empire under Empress Maria Theresia did its very best to compete with Versailles. And the architect Fischer von Erlach, the man who started with this project, he studied Versailles very, very carefully. And then, of course, this was a project that went well beyond his lifespan, as these grand palaces tended to do. So there were other architects that worked on it. Only the central part is still original Fischer von Erlach, and it's become larger and larger. It has gone from Baroque to neoclassical in some places. In Schönbrunn, the rooms are all decorated in various different styles of the rulers that were there, and that's actually a really interesting aspect of this palace, because you will walk through the different rooms and you will get an idea of the history of the Habsburg emperors. There's one room, for instance, the last emperor had kind of a little fitness studio in one of the rooms. And it's like very early 20th century fitness equipment. And to me, that makes it a really interesting experience. The second part, of course, of Schönbrunn is the gardens. And they are absolutely magnificent. They themselves are worth half a day. We will take you there on an optional excursion, and there are various different things that you can combine. So your day in Vienna normally, and on some of these itineraries you have 2 days, but your day in Vienna usually starts with a tour that gives you an overview, and then you have a lot of different choices. As it goes, Vienna is a city where you could easily spend 10 days, and we always want you to come back for more, so we schedule a day and a half, 2 days in Vienna. And you have to make some choices sometimes. And so the optional excursions allow you to tailor the program to what you really want to do. Schönbrunn obviously is very popular. What we do, for instance, at the Belvedere is we give you an opportunity to become your own Klimt. You get to work with an artist who will instruct you in the art of creating a Klimt-like gold piece that you get to take home. One of the most, not for everyone, but for the people that do this, it really becomes the highlight of their trip, because they get to do something, they get to immerse themselves into this period of history, they learn a lot about what made Klimt so revolutionary. it's very tangible when people come back. Schönbrunn, on the other hand, it's these magnificent rooms. It's the beautiful gardens. I think the next slide shows you a peek of the gardens and one of the rooms that is quite famous. This is a Rococo room, and that was a style that followed after the Baroque style. It's more of a refinement, if you will. At the end of the 1700s, Rococo started to borrow, and it's not that easy to see, but these panels on the walls, those are Oriental paintings. The Orient, Japan, China, they were coming into vogue in the palaces of Europe, and so Rococo was a little bit more playful than Baroque, a little bit less centered on just what at the time was the West. There were more exotic influences in this style, so it's more or less a culmination of what Baroque was. And once you have your fill of the palace itself, you can then walk out and see the Glorietta, which is this structure at the end of the gardens in Schönbrunn, and that's on the next slide. And in the foreground there, you can see something that was quite typical for Baroque. This is all these sculptures are part of a water feature, and those were very, very popular. You would always have these very refined sculptures, and quite often in gardens they would be placed on these very rough, almost natural-looking structures that were, of course, also very, very sculpted, but they were very deliberately kept in a somewhat more primitive state. And then this next garden that you will see, all of a sudden you will see some young men in the next garden. Sorry, it's one more slide over. And these young men are part of a long tradition that also was an imperial tradition. The emperor had a choir of young boys that would be there mainly for the court. And from the get-go, because the emperor had such a large swath of Europe under him, he would travel, and then the choir would every once in a while travel with him. Today, the choir travels all over the world. A lot of the boys that graduate from this school become musicians, but rather than I talk about it, let's have Karina talk about it, because she visited the Vienna Boys Choir in a behind-the-scenes visit. That is something that we can share on select departures with our guests, and this is because we have a special relationship with the Boys Choir, where we get to visit the young men, the boys, in their place of work and in their place of living. We both visit behind the scenes, and the visits always also include a small, very private, very intimate little concert. But let's have a look at the video.
1, 2, 3, up!
Witnessing the boys rehearsing before their evening performance is like listening to a choir of angels. Established by the Habsburg Empire in 1498, the Vienna Boys Choir provides a solid education and a chance to explore different countries.
The greatest part of being a member is probably going on tour the whole world.
Through the concerts, the boys gain perspective and self-confidence.
When I walk out on stage, I just feel free, hearing the applause from everybody. Yeah, it feels great.
In all, there are approximately 100 members from countries around the globe.
Ron, how long have you been here?
2 years.
2 years.
Right.
Yeah. And you came from
St. Petersburg.
St. Petersburg. We heard you singing earlier, and it was absolutely beautiful. Your parents must be very proud.
Yeah, I think so.
With a thorough musical background in hand, many boys eventually become professional vocalists and treasure their days in the choir.
They think back to their past and remember that they were a member, and then think, I've had the best past that I could have ever had.
Viking river cruises, sharing privileged access to the culture of Europe.
Excellent. And now we're in the heart of Vienna. And what you're looking at is an interior shot and an exterior of the Stephansdom. And of course, this is Saint Stephen. Saint Stephen was the patron saint of Vienna. And every big city in Europe, and especially in the German-speaking part of Europe, has its own cathedral. And generally, they tend to be called Dom or Münster. There's no rhyme or reason to it. I live in a city in Basel, in Switzerland, that has a Gothic cathedral that is called the Münster. In Cologne, it's called the Dom. And in Vienna, it's also called the Dom. It basically just means the main cathedral in the city. And so this is the inspiration for what you saw earlier, that neo-Gothic city hall. And there's quite a few buildings in Vienna that will take their cues from the Stephansdom. There is a church, for instance, a very large church. You will, without any doubt, see it when you travel the Ringstraße, called the Votivkirche. And that actually has a bit of a murder mystery, or an almost murder mystery background. It's a neo-Gothic church that was built on a site where someone tried to kill the Austrian emperor. And it didn't work, and the emperor, out of gratitude, then built a church right on that spot. Now, in the next slide, you will see a very famous view of the Stephansdom. It's one of only a few Gothic cathedrals, and it's probably the only one in its size that has such a magnificent tile roof with all different colors and different patterns. This is really, and you can get on the roof. It's quite a climb, but this is really one of my favorite views in the city, because it's just very, those roofs, you have those quite a bit in France, in Burgundy, but they're usually much smaller buildings. I don't believe that there's any other roof that can compete with the roof of St. Stephen's. And if you are in St. Stephen, this is the beautiful thing in Vienna, because we're now going to switch gears a little bit again. We're getting back into the Habsburg Empire, and their favorite architectural style was definitely Baroque. Baroque is a little after Gothic architecture, and a lot of the former imperial buildings, which are now government buildings quite often, are in the Baroque style or in Neo-Baroque style. And in the next slide, you can see a really good example of that. The next slide shows the Imperial Palace. And there are some apartments in the Imperial Palace that you can visit. They are the ones that the last emperor of Austria, Sissi, spent time in, and she is such a, you may have seen the Romy Schneider movies. She was incredibly popular among the people in Hungary. She spent a lot of time there, and she was very sweet, and Hungary, as you can imagine. So you imagine that you're in the empire and the kingdom, and you live in the kingdom, and so you're kind of, well, we just live in the kingdom. The Hungarians quite often felt like second-rate citizens in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But Sissi spent a lot of time in Budapest. There was a beautiful palace just outside of Budapest called Gödöllő, and she was beloved by the Hungarians. And the Viennese actually saw that too, and they fell in love with her, and she became one of the most, she was probably, if you will, pardon the comparison, but she was like the Lady Di at the time. And they made these incredibly popular movies in the 1930s and 40s and 50s that usually starred Romy Schneider. There was a series of them that depicted the life of Sissi. And so her rooms in the palace are probably one of the highlights of anyone's visit in Vienna. They're very, very popular. There's a lot more there. There is the Imperial Library. We'll get to that in a minute. The next slide I want to show you is the Spanische Hofreitschule. And that is quite a mouthful, but it's basically, when they say, well, this is where they have the Libizon horses, you're like, oh, I get it now. why would you use such a terrible German expression? This is where not only you can visit the horses as they perform, and they're the best trained horses in the world, really. What they do, I'm told, I'm not a horse expert, what they do is incredibly difficult, takes a lot of training, takes a lot of discipline, both for the horse and for the rider. And it's been there for centuries. It's the oldest institution of its kind. And you have an opportunity to see the inner workings where you go a little bit behind the scenes during training time to get an idea of what the horses' lives are like outside of the performances. The performances take place according to a calendar, and if that is what you prefer to do, you usually need to take quite a good chunk of your time out of your schedule in Vienna, because there are set times and the calendar is immovable. So it may happen in the middle of your morning that you would be able to get tickets for the Spanische Hofreitschule to see the Lipizan horses in their performances. If you are a horse person, I don't think you can leave Vienna without going to the Spanische Hofreitschule. Okay, and then the next slide shows the Imperial Library. And the Imperial Library is, again, because it was at one point such an incredibly large empire, it has books from all over Europe. It has something in the neighborhood of 30,000 volumes and counting, many of which are things, books and manuscripts that played an enormous role in Europe's history. And ironically, here we have the Austrian Empire that was until the very end very, very Catholic. And it just so happens that in the library, they have a lot of very important writings by Martin Luther, who is on the right-hand side of this image. Luther, of course, who kicked off the Reformation that shook Europe and that made quite a few changes in the landscape. Also in the architectural landscape, by the way. Luther was a man who came on the scene right around the time of the Italian Renaissance. And his Reformation led to a Counter-Reformation. And the Counter-Reformation, again, gave rise to the architectural style of the Baroque. So in some way, Luther actually, with his Reformation, contributed to a change in architecture, which I always find quite interesting, because you can see that architecture is not just a matter of style. It's also sometimes a matter of politics and a matter of religion. And certainly Baroque is that. Then we have another, and this is just an example of a neoclassical interior. This happens to be in a house that at one point was inhabited by Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. And this is where he wrote the La Nozze di Figaro. He spent a lot of time, because he was a court musician. He spent a lot of time in Vienna, although he was born in Salzburg, and he spent a lot of time there. The Mozart house in Vienna, as you can see here, if you look very closely, this is not an actual room. It is a trompe l'oeil. It's basically a painting that shows the room as it looked at the time. It's a very well done, relatively modern, very playful museum that depicts Mozart's life and his times as he spent them on the imperial court. And the next image is from that same museum. It just shows another a little scene of something that Mozart would have had in his house. It's just to give you a good impression of what the time is like. And now we're kind of getting to the end of the presentation, but to give you an insight, I talked a little bit about the Gothic style, and it is something that is all over Europe. The Stephansdom in Vienna is a perfect example, but on every cruise that you would do through the face of Europe, whether it's on the Seine, where you go to Rouen, or of course to Paris, or on the Rhine, where you can visit Cologne and where you can visit Basel, or or on the Danube in Regensburg and in Vienna, you will find Gothic cathedrals. On the Rhine in Strasbourg, of course, beautiful cathedral. And Karina has done this beautiful little video that I would want to show as kind of a finale of the Gothic cathedrals in Europe.
Infinity, made imaginable, is how philosopher Samuel Taylor Coleridge described Gothic architecture. Stand inside a cathedral from this period and you'll understand what he meant. The walls extend almost infinitely high above, as if climbing to heaven. It was the powerful state of France that started the transition from Romanesque, a grounded, solid architectural style characterized by thick walls and round arches, to the soaring new heights of the Gothic style in the early 12th century. Innovations such as the ribbed vault and flying buttress created a lacy, almost ethereal quality to the new cathedrals, which boasted high walls, pointed arches reaching to the sky, and windows bathing interiors with heavenly colored light. The stained glass not only contributed to the holy atmosphere, but also illustrated biblical stories for the illiterate masses. The Gothic style evolved over the next 400 years, but one of its drawbacks was the immense cost. Economic downturns led to many unfinished cathedrals. Germany's Cologne Cathedral being a prime example. Begun in 1248, it took more than 600 years to complete. With the dawn of the 16th century, architecture came under the influence of the Renaissance, as Europe entered a new age of humanism and departed from the focus on God and the afterlife. So it was that along with a change in emphasis from the heavenly to the temporal, architecture too changed forever. The Gothic cathedrals of Europe endure as monuments of ingenuity and faith. These testimonials to a bygone era where religion was the center of life never fail to inspire awe. When you visit Europe, be sure to spend some time in a few of its grand cathedrals. Explore Cologne Cathedral, or perhaps view Monet's beloved Rouen Cathedral. Take a moment, pause in silence, and look up. You may even catch a glimpse of heaven.
And that last shot, the last cathedral you saw, that was Strasbourg Cathedral. That's actually not far from where I live in Basel, and I like the shot at the end because it shows exactly what Karina said. These cathedrals cost massive amounts of money, and quite often, somewhere along the line, as these cathedrals were built over centuries, money just ran out. And Strasbourg Cathedral is such a beautiful example because you can totally tell that the idea was to have two of these towers. And after the one tower, the money just ran out. So here is an aerial view of Vienna. This is something that you could see from, it's not exactly at the Belvedere, but it's fairly close to the Belvedere, where you have this view beyond the skyline of the city along the Ringstrasse. And then in the hills of Vienna, that's where you have the Heurigen. Those are the wine pubs. You know, just on the outskirts of Vienna, there are these vineyards, and they sell very young wine. And most of the wine never really sees a bottle. It goes so quickly into consumption because those are great places to hang out in fall. Where there's traditional music, where there is a lot of, it's very simple, very basic food, and is really fresh wine. And obviously we offer that to our guests as something to do if you're at some point a little tired of the the urban ways of Vienna. Then you can go a little bit out in the countryside. And so in the left of the picture, that is again the city hall. That's kind of where we started. Then you see this Votivkirche, the one they built because the emperor escaped from an attempt on his life. And in the foreground, you see the Grand Theater along the Ringstraße. And then I think what we have left is to just give you a little bit of an overview of what you could tack on at the end of your cruise. And as you may know, usually we give a little bit of a direction to the way we narrate our itineraries. They go from Amsterdam to Budapest, or from Budapest to Amsterdam. In this case, we have decided to kind of focus on the Amsterdam to Budapest direction, and then, or let's say Regensburg to Budapest. And this is why these show up as our post extensions. So by the time you get to Budapest, from Regensburg or Passau or Amsterdam, you can spend another 2 nights in Budapest. And I would highly recommend that. And now that you've had a little crash course in the architectural styles of Europe, that is the image that you see there is it's the Parliament building in Budapest, and that's neo-Gothic style. That was built at the end of the 19th century, and it's inspired by the Gothic cathedrals of Europe. And then at the bottom, you see Prague, and what you see there is actual Bohemian Gothic. In the foreground, you see the clock tower that is next to the city hall in Prague. And then in the background, you see the Church of Our Lady on Tin. And that is, with those little turrets, that is the Gothic style of Central Europe. You have that in the Czech Republic and in Poland, all the way down to Hungary and to Romania. 3 nights in Prague is not a luxury. You can easily spend a week there. So 3 nights, I think, is something that you should absolutely do, especially if you just want to spend, if you have a week only on the Danube, there's so much more that you can do. Nuremberg for 2 nights before the romantic Danube is a great idea, because Nuremberg is it's a city that has layer on layer on layer of history. Some of it very dark, some of it related to World War II, and the Nuremberg trials were there to put on trial the criminals of the Nazi regime. But Nuremberg has a history that goes a lot further back. You can see here, and much of this had to be rebuilt after World War II, but you can see that it has a very medieval flair. If you're into Gothic cathedrals now, it also has 2 beautiful, relatively small, but beautiful Gothic churches. And then you could combine Nuremberg and Prague if you want to be a little bit more extravagant. I would absolutely do that. I think if you're already there, those 2 cities are absolutely worth it when you are already in Central Europe. They're 2 real highlights of Central Europe. And then we have a few more that are going further. Now we're going further down, or actually one is going further down the Danube towards Romania, and the other is on the upper end of the Danube. And I understand that this is a little confusing. This is why I said earlier on, you would really have to study this a little bit. And I think this is the great thing that we do when we have these extensions. You can really piece together what it is that you would like to do. You have a little bit of, you're in the driver's seat for much of this. And so what you see in the top picture, that is a part of Romania that is best known for Count Dracula and the myths surrounding him. And it's also an area that has this beautiful architecture that emerged there. And you can see that there is Central European, Czech, even a little bit of German influence in the architecture. And that's because the people that lived there originally came from Germany. And the area is called Transylvania today, but for many, many centuries, it was known as Siebenburgen, which is a German word for 7 castles. And that's how it originally was populated. There were 7 small fortified villages that became Transylvania as we know it today. And then at the bottom is Munich. You see the city hall there. That's also by and large a neo-Gothic building that has a few elements that are older. And on this extension, you see both Munich and Salzburg. And of course, Salzburg is where they filmed The Sound of Music, the birthplace of Mozart. And both cities are actually, both cities I like because they so well deliver on the postcard image that you have. Some cities surprise you. Most cities are pleasant surprises, and some cities are just completely different from what you imagine them to be. Munich and Salzburg completely deliver on the image that you would have. And yes, you will find people in Salzburg in particular, not very many, but you'll see them. It's quite normal in the streets. Munich is the same thing, that will dress a little like Julie Andrews in Sound of Music. Seriously, I'm kidding you not. And I think, James and Heather, this brings us to the end of my talk. And now it's time for Heather to pitch me your questions.
Thank you so much, Joost. Our first question for tonight comes from Bob in the United States. He says, I will be on the Romantic Danube cruise in June 2022. Can you tell us which of these sites we will visit during the included shore excursion?
In Vienna, you mean? Yes. So in Vienna, you will not go inside most of these buildings because the city tour itself is really just thought to be an overview. On the Romantic Danube, you easily have enough time to then, after you have done your city tour, to either go to Schönbrunn or visit the Belvedere. In the evening, you can visit a Mozart and Strauss concert that gives you a look of the Ringstraße at night. And it's one of those streets that is just made to be lit up at night. There is a statue of Strauss along the ring road, and there's a statue of Mozart, and they're all lit. It's a beautiful city to travel around in at night. The Hofburg is easy to visit, and the Stephansdom is normally traditionally where we end our walking tour. The traditional sightseeing in Vienna starts with a tour of the ring road. Then there's a little bit of a walk through the heart of Vienna. And you end with a little bit of time to explore on your own, and that's the perfect time to have a look around the Stephansdom. And then, yes, then unfortunately you need to make some hard choices of what to do in the afternoon. What you shouldn't forget, and I've been spending a lot of time talking about architecture, Vienna has some of the best cafes in the world. And depending on what it is that you like to eat, and I kind of like them all, but you should go to Hotel Sacher for the Sachertorte, which combines apricot and chocolate, beautiful cake, or you go and have a piece of Fächertorte, and that has nuts and poppy seed, which is very popular in Central Europe, and a whole bunch of other things. And it's quite okay if you decide to limit your explorations of Vienna just to the coffee houses. Lots of people do that. They just go from one coffee house to another. And it's incredible people watching. It's the best coffee in the world. We could fill a whole program with just talking about coffee in Vienna. Vienna was Starbucks long before Starbucks existed. And of course, food. Vienna is spectacular for food, but I digress.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Joost. Question from Isaac in the United States, and he asks, is a horse and carriage ride included in any of Viking's excursions?
In some excursions it is. It's not part of the standard program simply because it's not everyone's thing. But yeah, we can absolutely make that happen. Yes.
Thank you. Erwin in Illinois in the United States asks, how close does the ship dock to the center of Vienna?
The ship docks on the Danube, and the Danube is not in the center of the city. Having said that, a coach ride in doesn't take more than about 15 minutes. And after 10 minutes, you start to see some really interesting bits and pieces of Vienna. So the dock along the Danube itself may not be the most interesting place in the world, but you very rapidly on the coach get a flavor of some highlights of Vienna. And then the best thing about Vienna, in my own personal opinion, is they have incredible public transportation. It's safe, it's easy, it's incredibly straightforward, and it's not expensive. And it is one of the best ways to just mingle with the locals. And so we encourage you to do this. We actually even have an alternative to the city tour where we say, okay, we're not using a coach. We're just going to use public transportation because I personally feel that that's the coolest way to explore the city. And you just use your own two legs and you use public transportation. It's easy, it's swift. There's absolutely no issue with the fact that the ship is not docked in the center. And it's not docked in the center, by the way, because the Danube doesn't run through the city. It did hundreds of years ago, and there's a tiny little trickle that still goes through the downtown area, and that is what was left of a canal that they dug to get ships into the city. But ships, by and large, stay outside of the city.
Perfect. Thank you, Joost. A question from Brian in Morgantown in the United States here. He asks, do you know, did the Ringstrasse replace some sort of fortification?
Yes, very good question. This is entirely par for the course in a lot of European cities, that you would have these city walls, and for a long time a city wall would protect the city, and that was all great, and everyone was happy with the city wall. And then cities started to grow, and then it all started to feel like a corset that was getting way too tight. And so in some cities in Europe, you can have city wall number 1, city wall number 2, and in many cities you will find little remnants of the old city walls. There are very few cities that have more than one of the city walls left. But yes, the last city wall around Vienna was torn down, and that's where you find the Ringstrasse. Because at some point, people realized that these walls were not really going to protect the cities all that much, and they only limited the growth that a city could experience. And Vienna Vienna kind of followed the example of Paris, where a lot of old houses, a lot of medieval vestiges were all torn down to create these big boulevards. And that was kind of the style of the times, of the end of the 19th century. Tear down those old walls and build these big, wide boulevards.
Thank you, Joost. Next question from Tanya in Springfield. She asks, do you know which is the oldest building in Vienna, and how long did some of these grand buildings take to build?
Okay, so that's kind of a two-part question. I would imagine that the Stephansdom is probably the building that has the longest construction history, because that was almost finished, and parts of it were torn down. Then in the 19th century, they added something. So the St. Stephen's has a construction history that spans, I think, about 400 years. And the oldest buildings in Vienna, if you want to call them buildings, they're easily accessible because they're kind of part of the whole complex of the Hofburg, the former imperial palace. When you walk through that, and it's hard to not find that particular spot because it's kind of on the edge of the area where the imperial palace stood and where part of it still stands. And then you get into the pedestrian zone. So it depends a little bit, but mostly your walking tours will take you by that area. And those are Roman ruins. Vienna started as a Roman settlement. And before that, there were probably Celts living in the area, but there's not a lot left of that. But the Roman ruins that you have there, you can still find today. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you, Joost. A question now from Mackenzie in the United States. Is there one architect in particular that one would associate with Vienna, as you would Gaudi with Barcelona, for example?
There are several, and the one thing that kind of fell out of the scope of this particular episode. We may need to do one later, because I'm a big fan of what in Vienna, in Austria, was called Jugendstil, and in other parts of the world it's called Art Nouveau, and in the US at the same time you had the arts and crafts movement. But you had this movement at the end of the 19th and at the beginning of the 20th century. Jugendstil basically means the style of youth. And these were buildings that were very colorful, very different use of forms, things that had never been seen before. And probably the best known exponent of that particular style was Otto Wagner. And at that same time, Vienna got its underground. And that means that Otto Wagner was commissioned to build a lot of the subway stations. So he did not build an awful lot of grand buildings. There's a church on the outside of Vienna that is actually quite big, but you can find Otto Wagner throughout the city because of these underground stations. If you were, for instance, I would recommend this. Take our coach with the guided tour to Schönbrunn. And then if you're brave enough and if you have your little card for the subway, you walk to the subway station, which is a beautiful Otto Wagner building. And you get on the subway and then you travel through the city, and you can pop out here and there, and then you walk through one of the things that Otto Wagner created. And there's one other place where Otto Wagner has some spectacular architecture, and that is a series of buildings along what the Viennese call the Naschmarkt. We have an excursion where you go with the chef of the ship onto the Naschmarkt. And it's basically a farmer's market. And it's more than a farmer's market. It's more of a delicatessen market. But there's a lot of fresh fruit and vegetables and even flowers. And it's one of the most beautiful places for foodies in all of Vienna. And along that market, there are two buildings that Otto Wagner designed. And those are spectacular. They're extremely colorful. They're unlike anything that had been built up until that time. And by now, colorful buildings and unusual shapes and sizes are much more common. But I always like to think what people thought when he designed these buildings, and they had red and green and yellow on the outside when the color was just brown. And I think Otto Wagner was a very, very heroic man, saying like, no, we need some color on these buildings. So he's my favorite. And I think if there's one that I would really associate, and any one architect that I would associate with Vienna, it's Otto Wagner.
Wonderful. Thank you, Joost. Claudia in St. Louis in the United States asks, is it possible to go inside the Vienna City Hall? And what is the building used for today?
Yeah, you can go inside. You'll be a little... You can probably not go into the rooms that they use for balls, for instance. They have enormous celebrations in that building. And I always have to chuckle because this is City Hall. You would expect just lots of office buildings with people doing their job at their desks. And Vienna City Hall has an awful lot of rooms that are grand and that are meant to celebrate in. And it all depends, because it's not just City Hall, it's also it's also where the regional government sits. So it's a huge complex, and what you can see inside always depends a little bit on what's going on at the time. I'm not sure that given everything else, given all the other beautiful interiors, and the art museum, for instance, that we saw is incredible. The interior there is beautiful. I would probably opt to go somewhere else, just because you never quite know what you can do in City Hall. And there's so many other interiors that are always open, that would probably not be my first choice.
Thank you. Jan in the United States says, The Viennese staircase you showed us looks like one of the grand staircases in the Hermitage in St. Petersburg in Russia. Do you happen to know if there is a connection?
To my knowledge, there isn't. I think it is just, well, let me put it this way. The connection obviously is that the Hermitage, yeah, here we go. So the style is different than what you see in the Hermitage, although you would have to really get into nitty-gritty detail. I think certainly where there was a connection is that St. Petersburg, Tsar Peter, who basically was the father of what we today know as St. Petersburg, it wasn't very spectacular before he decided to really put his shoulders under that project. And Tsar Peter spent an awful lot of time traveling through all over Western Europe to gather ideas and to put Russia on the trajectory of modernity. And off the top of my head, I'm not entirely sure, but I would be very surprised if Tsar Peter would not have spent a little bit of time looking at Versailles at the time and possibly looking at Vienna. He certainly had the opportunity, and he was a student. He was a student. The Dutch know Tsar Peter because he worked for a little while as a carpenter in a shipyard. He knew that in order for St. Petersburg to become a center of power in the world, he needed ships. So he decided as the Tsar, why don't I become a carpenter and really know how to learn ships, how to learn to build ships? He was an incredible man. He was all over Europe. I'm sure that there is that connection at the very minimum.
Thank you. Question now from Lucas in the United States, and he says, you mentioned some of the special events that are held in Vienna. Is it ever possible for an American to attend a grand Viennese ball?
If you're a celebrity, then yes. If you're very well connected in Viennese society, then yes. Alas, if you're a mere mortal, it's virtually impossible. It is really this society that is amongst itself, and it's very large, and it's really kind of this upper echelon.
Thank you. A question now from Harriet in San Diego, a little more of a personal question, and she says, Joost, which is your personal favourite building in Vienna?
My personal favorite building in Vienna. That's really tough because I love the Viennese Art Nouveau. It's a little, so I like the house that I described that Otto Wagner did, but I also really like St. Stephen's. I'm a big fan of Gothic architecture, and the beautiful. I'm going to go for St. Stephen's, and I'll tell you why. Many people don't do this when they're on tours, and I always think it's somewhat of a shame. But these cathedrals, they're large, and they have so many nooks and crannies, and there are so many different things that you can find if you only take the time. And St. Stephen's is certainly one of those where you can spend a good hour and a half to just look at the little details, and those I love. So yeah, I would have to go. Yeah, I would have to go for St. Stephen's.
Thank you. And Sean in the United States asks, was St. Stephen's where Mozart got married?
Yes, it was. It's not only where he got married, it's where his two children were baptized. Yeah.
Fantastic, thank you. And Karen in Ocean Grove asks, which of the cruises on the Danube would give you the most time to explore Vienna?
I believe that would be the Danube Waltz. But we have, over the years, we've noticed, and we listen to what you tell us on your questionnaires, and we've noticed that what a lot of people wanted is just more time in Vienna. But the Danube Waltz traditionally has always had the most time, and over the years we have kind of converged on we need to have at least a day and a half in Vienna. So Danube waltz, but I think the other 3 cruises are not very far behind.
Thank you. And we just have some useful comments sent in by some viewers that I'll just share if you have any further thoughts on these, Joost. So Scott in the United States, he says, the included and the full day optional excursions fit together very nicely. Visiting both the Hofburg Palace, where Marie Antoinette was born, and the Schönbrunn Palace supplement each other, and you get to learn to waltz.
That is right. That's a very good comment. One of the things that we do, and we don't have time to show all of these, you have to go on our website. There is a very cute video where Karina learns how to waltz, or I'm sure that she knows how to waltz, but she spent time at the dancing school that we visit with our guests, where if you're a little rusty or if you've never done it before, where else would you want to waltz but in Vienna? Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. And another comment here from Michelle in the United States, who says, I've been to Vienna many times and my favourite time is December. The Christmas markets, the atmosphere, the food and the people. I just wanted to let people know that it's not only beautiful in the summer.
I would absolutely second that motion. Yes.
Thank you very much, Joost. So just to finish off, we've had some very nice comments sent in tonight. We have Mrs. K Ringroad in the United States. She's saying, Mr. Ouendag, a friend of mine who loves Viking.TV, told me you are like a jukebox of travel knowledge. I agree.
All right, thank you. Never been called a jukebox before in my life, but thank you.
And we have Karen who says, great job, Joost. Love your hosted series this year. Hoot zo.
Dank u wel.
And Lisa who says, wonderful programme. And this comment was actually sent in Dutch from one of our very loyal viewers, Miki. But thanks to the wonders of Google Translate, she would like to wish you and your family a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. And she hopes to see you in March next year when she'll be travelling on the Rhine to Basel.
Thank you. And to you.
Thank you, Joost.
Thank you.